He was a man who believed the world would never catch him. A man who carried no gun, wore no blood-stained uniform, yet caused more death than most soldiers on the front lines. His power came not from physical strength, but from a pen, a signature, a cold judgment delivered from behind polished glasses. Werner Heide, once celebrated as a brilliant psychiatrist, became one of the most chilling architects of mass murder during the Nazi regime. The number connected to his name, 150,000 lives, was not an accident, not a side effect of war, but a deliberate execution plan he helped design. He hid behind words like science, progress, and purification, while condemning disabled children and adults to brutal, silent deaths. His victims were people who could not fight, could not run, and could not understand why they were being led into rooms where the doors locked from the outside. They were told they were being treated. They were told they were safe. And then their voices vanished. Heide operated with chilling precision. He evaluated medical files as if they were grocery lists, marking names with small symbols that decided fate. Those markings meant death, carried out in hospitals that had been transformed into disguised killing centers. Gas chambers inside medical wards, lethal injections given as routine treatment, starvation disguised as diet therapy. Nurses and doctors followed his orders because he represented authority, and authority under the Nazi system meant unquestionable obedience. In dark hallways that smelled of chemicals and metal trays, thousands of disabled individuals took their final breaths while the outside world remained unaware. There were no battlefields, no soldiers shouting orders, no gunshots, only quiet rooms, white walls, and a doctor whose signature determined who lived and who disappeared. Werner Heide perfected the art of killing without ever dirtying his hands. When the war ended and the Nazi Empire collapsed into rubble, the world began hunting the monsters who engineered such horrors. But some monsters are experts at hiding. Heide vanished like smoke. He didn't escape to South America like many war criminals. He didn't live in exile. He simply melted back into Germany under a new identity. Dr. Fritz Sawad. The most disturbing part? He lived openly. He didn't hide in forests or distant villages. He lived in neighborhoods surrounded by families, children, and the very society he once claimed to protect. For 14 long years, Heide enjoyed a life of comfort, respect, and stability. He returned to the medical world, confidently practicing psychiatry as if his past no longer existed. Colleagues respected him. Patients trusted him. Courts even appointed him as an expert witness in criminal cases, asking for his medical opinions, never realizing that he had personally overseen mass murder. There is something deeply chilling about a man who creates so much suffering yet continues to walk calmly among the people, smiling politely, shaking hands, advising judges, and writing medical reports. He believed he was untouchable. The world was rebuilding after the war, and in that chaos, people forgot. Governments moved on. New problems emerged. And in that environment of reconstruction and distraction, a monster like Heide thrived. But the universe has strange ways of circling back. Justice sometimes comes not from powerful leaders, not from courts or armies, but from the very people who were once considered powerless, helpless, and unworthy of life. Some of Heide's victims survived the T4 killing program by chance, transferred too late, hidden by courageous staff, or simply overlooked among piles of documents. These survivors, disabled but alive, carried memories that most of the world tried to bury. As adults, they recognized patterns in psychiatric reports, phrases that sounded too familiar, methods that resembled those used during the Nazi era. Rumors began spreading among disability rights groups. Activists and caretakers started digging. Signatures were compared. Old documents surfaced. And slowly, horrifyingly, everything pointed to one impossible truth. Dr. Fritz Sawade, the respected physician, was Werner Heide, the architect of the T4 euthanasia killings. It started with whispers in hospital hallways, then small newspaper articles, then public pressure. Institutions that had unknowingly hired Heide were forced to answer questions. Survivors, many with physical disabilities or developmental challenges, gathered the courage to speak publicly. Some struggled to form words. Others used assistive devices to communicate. But all of them said the same thing. The man who tried to kill us is still alive. One young disabled man, who had narrowly escaped a T4 facility as a child, delivered the statement that finally broke the silence. We were once called unworthy of living, but we lived, and we will not let him hide anymore. Authorities were embarrassed. Courts were forced to reopen the case, and suddenly, the quiet world Heide had built shattered. He turned himself in, believing he could still manipulate the situation. He thought his age would gain sympathy. He thought his medical reputation would soften the accusations. He thought he could talk his way out of facing the people he had sentenced to death. But for the first time in decades, he had lost control. And the part that terrified him most wasn't the prison cell. It wasn't the trial. It wasn't even the evidence stacked against him. It was the people waiting for him in the courtroom. On the day he appeared behind the defendant's table, he looked up and froze. The courtroom was filled with disabled survivors, some in wheelchairs, some with crutches, some with facial scars, some with trembling hands they could barely control. They weren't soldiers. They weren't police. They were ordinary people who had been written off as inferior by the same man who now shook uncontrollably in front of them. Their presence, quiet but powerful, delivered a kind of justice a courtroom verdict could never match. For Heide, facing the people he once condemned was worse than any prison sentence. He lowered his head. Reporters wrote that he looked pale, sweating, whispering to his lawyer,
I cannot face them. I cannot face what they remember.
Most war criminals fear evidence. Heide feared eyes that had once looked up at him with confusion and fear as he marked their forms with symbols of death. Those same eyes were now older, scarred, determined, and filled with a strength he never expected. The disabled survivors who were supposed to die had come to watch him answer for his crimes, and it broke him. He knew what awaited him in the coming days. Testimony after testimony from people whose lives he tried to erase. He knew they would describe the gas chambers disguised as showers, the doctors who injected children as if they were doing routine checkups, the starvation rooms, the cold steel tables. He knew the courtroom would hear about the families torn apart, the children who disappeared, the parents who never received answers. And so, the night before the testimonies were to begin, Werner Heide made his final decision. In a prison cell that smelled of damp concrete and old blankets, he took his own life. No note, no apology, no explanation. The man who had sentenced thousands to death chose to escape his own judgment. But his suicide wasn't an act of regret. It was an act of cowardice. He couldn't face the people he underestimated. He couldn't listen to their stories. He couldn't let the world witness how his victims had survived and gathered the strength to confront him. His death was not justice. It was an admission of fear. But the true justice came from the survivors themselves. They outlived him. They exposed him. They destroyed his false identity. And in the end, they forced him to look into the eyes of the people he once stamped as worthless. Their existence became the punishment he could never escape. Werner Hede died not as a respected doctor, not as an intellectual, but as a coward hiding in a cell. Meanwhile, the disabled survivors he tried to eliminate became living proof that the greatest victory sometimes comes from the people the world tries to silence. Their voices shattered his lies. Their presence destroyed his arrogance, and their survival erased the myth of his power. The man who believed disabled people had no value ultimately met his downfall because they lived long enough to expose him. And that is the kind of justice no court in the world can ever surpass.